We're here right now to talk about something that was mentioned in the earlier plenary session by Mike Lawler, who talked about the efforts in Connecticut to raise the age and change the approach for young adult justice. And when he mentioned that, it sounded like there was this collective gasp and sigh. And so I think it is, as Julia's headlined, kind of a recent new approach that's gaining some traction, and I think it's an exciting one. And so I'm looking forward for the chance to talk with our panelists about it. So today I think we're going to learn hopefully a little bit about brain science, but we're also going to learn about some of the efforts and opportunities to create a new approach to young adult justice. So let me start by welcoming our panelists. And I want to just give a quick caveat. We did have Assistant Attorney General Carol Mason was scheduled to come, and she's unable to, I believe, due to sickness, and we're sorry she's not here. But as you look at my mug and get ready to stream out of the front doors, out of the doors, I do want to just say we've got two terrific folks here to speak. And so, wait a second. Okay, this is the part where I lose the bios. So let me start by introducing Vinnie Schiraldi, who is a senior research fellow directing the Harvard Kennedy School's program in criminal justice, where he focuses on creating a more developmentally appropriate response to offending by young adults, ending the use of youth prisons for juveniles, and ending mass incarceration. I got to know Vinnie when he was Commissioner of Probation in New York City, where he was responsible for initiating innovative policies and programs like the Neighborhood Opportunity Networks, or known as NEONs, and the Close to Home initiative. And under Vinnie's watch, probation violations fell by 45% to a statewide low of 3%, and young adults in the NEONs experienced 23% lower rearrest rates than youth with similar risk who did not participate in NEONs. Before that, Vinnie ran the juvenile justice system in Washington, D.C. for 5 years, and prior to that, he had founded and ran 2 cutting-edge nonprofits that sought to eliminate mass incarceration, the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice in San Francisco and the Justice Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. So that's Vinnie down there. And Brent Cohen is a senior advisor to Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Justice Programs, OJP, at the U.S. Department of Justice. His portfolio includes making the criminal justice system more developmentally responsive to young adults and President Obama's My Brother's Keeper initiative. Immediately before joining DOJ, Brent was one of 12 individuals appointed by the President to the 2013-14 class of White House Fellows. Previously, he had served as the Director of Legislative and Government Affairs for New York City's Department of Probation, which I believe was under Vinnie. Yep. And so I want to welcome both of them. And I think we should kick things off with giving each of them an opportunity to make an opening statement. So,
Good morning, everybody. Thank you guys for inviting me here. What a great packed room it is to have this conversation. As was mentioned earlier, I don't think there just really wasn't a lively conversation about this population of young people even a year ago, never mind 2 years ago. And now there's just a lot of activity in the area. When I ran the juvenile justice system in Washington, D.C., kids had to have committed their crime before the age of 18, and then they could stay in our, if they were placed in our custody and care, they could stay in our custody and care till age 21. Usually that was on aftercare. And then when I went to New York, the age of jurisdiction ends on your 16th birthday. New York's one of only 2 states in the country where that is true. So we had on probation, literally, it would be, and you're tried automatically as an adult at age 13 for some crimes and 14 and 15 for a whole bunch more crimes. So we would actually have 14-year-olds it wasn't uncommon to have 14-year-olds on adult probation. And so it was a sort of wildly different approach where you'd see these 14-year-olds sit in a big waiting room in the Brooklyn probation office where 6,000 people reported every month in this clearly very inappropriate, adult-focused probation experience, and then in D.C. you'd have people who are 20 years old on our caseloads and juvenile caseloads. And it really got me wondering and thinking about how sort of arbitrary our lines are on this group of young people who's either adolescents or young adults who are developing, and made me curious about that moment, and eroded my respect for all those lines and for all those magic birthdays. It's Jeff Butz's term. He got me thinking first and informed me that in Germany, since the 1950s, they've allowed judges, kids' cases start in juvenile court up to age 21 in Germany, and have done since the 1950s, 1953. And that's because in 1953, you had all these teenagers whose fathers were killed in the war that were running the streets because they didn't have any fathers. And instead of gravitating towards locking them up, because they had just had this really horrible experience with the Holocaust, they changed their law so that the juvenile court could adjudicate them. And interestingly, what happened then was initially 20% of the kids were tried as juveniles, and the other 80% were sent to adult court. Now it's 67% of kids in Germany between the ages of 18 and 21 stay in juvenile court. And interestingly, the way it breaks down from an offense standpoint is 90% of the kids, when I say kids, I mean young adults, 18 to 21-year-olds, accused of homicide stay in juvenile court, and about half of the fraud cases and automobile cases, traffic cases, get tried as adults. And the reason for that is that there are mandatory sentences for homicide, and there's as with us, the rehabilitative programming in the adult system isn't what it is in the juvenile system, so the judges prefer to keep the kids in the system that they won't get longer sentences and they have more rehabilitative services, whereas the collateral consequences for being in the adult system aren't so bad in Germany. It's not like you're stained forever because you have a traffic offense or a fraud case. So they send them there, and they generally get day fines or community service or some such thing. So, as it did with, to some degree, with Governor Malloy in Connecticut, this started me thinking about whether and I see Mike Lawler here, and Governor Malloy talks about how his proposal to raise the age to 21 was influenced by a trip he took to Connecticut, to Germany, which many of you may have seen on 60 Minutes. Got me thinking about, are there better ways that we could handle this group of young people? So what do we know about this group of young people? Well, first of all, we know that we're learning more every single day, and that researchers are involved in research about brain science, about developmental psychology, also about the changing nature of adolescence, but that they're somewhere in between fully fledged juveniles and fully mature adults, whatever the hell that means, by the way. I'm still working on that whole full maturity thing myself, and but that they're more volatile in emotionally charged settings, they're less future-oriented, they're more susceptible to peer pressure, and they're greater risk takers, particularly, all of that's particularly true if they suffer from traumatic brain injury, which in Rikers Island, about half of the kids report suffering from. So it's not an unusual event for kids in a criminal justice system. And but also the nature of adolescence has changed pretty dramatically since we founded the juvenile court, and even since I was born. So in 1960, well, backing up a half step, criminologists believe that there are certain bridges one has to cross from adolescence to mature to adulthood that help one mature out of or age out of delinquent behavior. Two really important ones and well-established ones are stable marriage and steady employment. And both of those things happened much later for today's generation than they did in the past. So in 1960, 45% of 18 to 25-year-olds were married. Now it's 9%, so 5 times as many were married in 1960 as were married now. Employment has dramatically declined for people prior to getting college degrees, before you could actually come out of high school. When I graduated high school, guys I graduated with, I lived in Brooklyn, literally they went to work on the stock market in brokerage jobs. They were not messengers. They were going to be stockbrokers at the age of 18 and could start a white-collar job. Right now, you need a master's degree from a good school to get that job. You need a bachelor's degree just to be an administrative assistant at those firms. Meanwhile, literally right down the block from us were 2 factories you could go work in, and if you went and worked in those factories, you could rent an apartment in my neighborhood, which is Greenpoint, where no entry-level factory worker can rent an apartment right now. Even if those factories were open, you couldn't afford those apartments today. So this group of young people is having who's developmentally different than adults and developmentally different from juveniles, is having their ability to forego immediate gratification and their association with peers stretched because they're not doing what my generation used to do, which is get a job and get married right away. Not because they're bad people, but because society has changed in the time since I graduated high school versus now. So what do we do about that? Last thing, then I'll stop. Or do you want me not to say what we'll do about that? And you can ask one of your brilliant questions.
I want to know what we're going to do about it in a minute. In a minute.
Okay, so I will stop there.
Okay, yes. Let's hold that thought in abeyance. Brent, do you want to have an opening statement? And maybe we'll also add to that a question, which is, what the heck is the U.S. Department of Justice doing here, and why do they care? What's your perspective on it?
Sure. So I will try to get to both of those. So also I echo Vinnie's thanks and express Carol's disappointment that she couldn't be here herself. I know she's particularly disappointed to miss this event because the issue of justice involved young adults is one of her personal priorities. And so as you can imagine, when your portfolio exists on young adults and your boss's priority or one of her priorities is young adults, it's a good place to be. And so I know she's disappointed not to be here with you this morning. And so I want to put a little bit of, when we talk about it, I'm going to go very granular for a second and then give a little bit slightly broader context as to why the Department of Justice is here. The granular part is really, I think we get into these conversations, and as we continue this conversation, we'll talk more in depth around brain science and potentially even starting to talk about synapses and pruning and what it looks like in impulse control and lack of impulse control. We'll talk about what that means for involvement in the justice system. Hopefully, and this is largely where justice comes in terms of our interest. It's not just about that individual, but what does it mean in terms of the rapid brain development that's taking place that allows for future behavior to be different, right? So hopefully we'll have a conversation, at least touch on that conversation. A really easy way to break that down in some ways is to think about the dumbest thing you did in college and then ask yourself if you would do the same thing today. For many people, the answer is no, right? And I think that really relates well when we start talking about justice-involved young adults. The way that manifests itself, what it looks like, how those actions get interpreted, whether or not it leads to justice involvement, we can have a separate conversation about that. But when we think about the basic normative behavior that 18 to 24-year-olds exhibit, it's pretty abnormal behavior many times for today, or if you're beyond 24, or if you're beyond 30, and you think about I had a roommate in college who thought it would be a good idea to drink and then get on a rolling desk chair and then go down the stairs in our 2-story home. It wasn't a good idea, right? But at 19, it seemed pretty funny. And so I think there's a whole lot of studies, and we'll talk about a lot of this, and the data is really there to back it up, that you do dumb things when you're in this age group. And then if you're in the wrong situation at the time, if you're in the wrong circumstances at the time, if you have access to weapons or drugs, or then those things start to materialize from being maybe that wasn't a good idea to, that just got me arrested, right? And sometimes in a more serious way. And so we do know some things, and I don't know if we're going to cover statistics, but part of the reason the Justice Department is here is because we know young adults are disproportionately likely to get arrested. We know they're disproportionately likely to get arrested for violent crimes. We know they're disproportionately likely to recidivate when compared to other populations. And we know, because of brain science, right, the science that tells us that the brain continues to develop, that there is a real significant opportunity to do something different, to intervene differently in a way that reduces the risk of future offending. And what that means is not just that one individual gets their life together, because hopefully that person, and that's what we're talking about, are people, young people, gets their life together and gets the supports they need to make better decisions and be successful and contribute. But it also means if they're not committing another crime, then there's someone who isn't becoming the victim of a crime. And so what that means for us is that we then have fewer victims and we have safer communities. And so as we have this conversation, those are some of the sort of overarching reasons why OJP and the Justice Department is at the table, is really thinking about how can we align policy and practice with the latest science so that we can produce the best outcomes for individuals and advance public safety most effectively.
Thank you. So before, I guess I want to kind of follow that up with, to see if you guys want to add anything about the brain science that you, to the extent you know. We're not experts, but but we heard Dr. Compton yesterday, who was not really directly addressing this, but it came up several times that the brain is still developing until age 25, that the frontal lobe is the place that takes the longest to develop, where there's impulse, and so there's the pleasure centers are fully developed, as we probably all remember, but the impulse control and ability to, as he put it, the brakes are not ready for some time. So I guess before we go on to what the answers are, I don't know if there's any other nuance you want to add to that.
First of all, I think what you said is enough for this conversation. My suspicion is if I'm sitting in the audience, I'd rather talk about what the implications of it all are and what the dangers of it all are, because I think there are implications and there are dangers.
All right, I'm slinking off. I mean, if I can't moderate you, please. No, go ahead.
No,
I know you're right. No, you're right. You're right. Go ahead.
Oh,
no, but
I think that there are several ways to try to skin a cat on this. First of all, I think this current system does a terrible job of dealing with this group. Aside from what Brent just described in terms of the recidivism rates, which are very real, my experience watching these kids walk into court in Brooklyn was, they walk through the metal detector, the guard glares at them, they take their belt and stuff off, they go to court, put their earbuds in, fall asleep. At some point, somebody barks their name, they stand up, prosecutor yells at them, the judge lectures them, defense attorney says something incomprehensible to them. Most of the time, they go home at that point. And then don't worry, they're going to be back real soon with some other thing. And we have all these smart and well-intentioned, by the way. Nobody's becoming a judge or a prosecutor or a defense attorney to do profoundly stupid stuff. It's just systemically, jointly, that's what we end up doing, right? And then so you have all these well-educated, dedicated people spending a lot of money on this, doing repeatedly pointless stuff that doesn't impact public safety, doesn't improve legitimacy, frustrates and angers these young people. And then if they get incarcerated, they just get thrown in, generally speaking, with everybody else in the population. They get put on probation, like I said. You treat the 17-year-olds the way you treat the 40-year-olds. And that's not to say that there aren't little shining lights of people doing different things, and we'll talk about those at some point. But the current system, let me put that to rest, by and large, is profoundly ineffective with this group of people, and up until a year or two ago wasn't innovating, and even now the level of innovation is very sort of sporadic and idiosyncratic. And this juxtaposes against our friends in Europe, where 4 out of 5 countries do something special for young adults, and where the UN and the EU and the Council of Europe's advisories and treaties recommend extending the benefits of the juvenile court to young adults, or treating young adults differently than older adults are treated in a whole variety of ways. And as I said, Germany, the Netherlands just raised the age of their juvenile court to 23. Croatia's 21. Lots of problems with the current system. Lots of innovation in Europe. Interestingly, the better research, I think, is from the U.S., but the greater level of innovation right now is in Europe and the UK, and I'm pointing to my friend over there, is the House of Commons has got a investigative body right now looking into changing the way the UK deals with young adults as well.
Brent, do you want to add something?
Yeah, just very quickly, I want to connect. I actually want to connect what Vinnie said about the current system, and I think most, if not all, of that would be applicable for all people, right? Something you walk in, they tell you take your belt off, you go through the metal detector, something incomprehensible is mumbled at you, you turn around, you walk out the door, you feel a little bit, less like a person perhaps than you did before you walked in and went through that experience. I think the impacts for young adults are particularly profound because of where they are in terms of their personal development and because of what we know around brain development and the fact that there is a real opportunity and a significant enhanced opportunity, right? Not to say that your brain ever stops changing. That's how we learn anything new. But there's this period of really rapid development that takes place, in which case you can almost, it's like rewriting the hard drive in some respects, right? And what we're doing with the current system is squandering the opportunity to do that in a positive way. And so instead of having positive interventions at that particular point, or some sort of developmentally appropriate intervention that really builds on the fact that all this brain development is taking place and that there can be a possibility for change, we're essentially just putting them through the same degrading system that doesn't really seem to work for most people and expecting a different result.
So there's brain for the buck, or low-hanging brain. Which
Sure.
Okay. Let's move on. Okay, let's let's move on to what we can actually. What are some of the things that are going on right now? I kind of want to, we heard from Mike before. We also heard in one of the panels on restorative justice a couple of efforts in Dane County and in Atlanta that were focused on this population. But I guess if you guys want to share a couple of things that are going on right now, that would be terrific. Yeah.
So there are three different styles of approaching this that I can think of, and maybe there are 5 or 10 that others could think of, but we've looked at it in 3 ways, and there's an article that Bruce Western and I have in Translational Criminology that talks all about these. One is you could create a whole new third system. To me, I'm most attracted by that. I think part of the strength of the juvenile system is, and there's plenty of weaknesses that I could talk about, but part of its strength is that it's a system. And because it's a system, researchers research it, there's case law about it, there's judges that specialize in it, there's prosecutors, there's defense attorneys, probation officers, we have separate facilities, philanthropy funds in it. We treat it like a system, we argue about it, we debate it, we screw it up, we fix it, but it's a system. And so there was a third system for young adults between the ages of 18 and 25, arguably, who are, I think, different enough from juveniles to warrant a system, but different enough from older adults to warrant a system. Then we could be looking more about education, workforce development, cognitive behavioral therapy, separate programs, separate courts. It would be my dream to have a jurisdiction that just started that and sort of went into it with the best stuff that we know, and we don't know every damn thing, but we know a hell of a lot more than Jane Addams knew when she started the juvenile court. So that's one thing we could do. Another thing is we could raise the age, and that's being discussed in Connecticut, in Vermont, and in Illinois. And when I say discussed, there's legislation passing through committees even as we speak. It's passed through the Judiciary Committee in Connecticut. It's passed through the Judiciary Committee in Illinois, and it's working its way in Vermont. In Vermont and Connecticut, the legislation would establish a committee to study this, bring all the stakeholders together, but write the legislation for the following year to raise the age. Connecticut's proposal is to raise it gradually, 1 year at a time. So July of 2017, raise it to 19, then to 20, then to 21, meaning ending on your 21st birthday. Vermont's is less defined. Illinois is to raise it for misdemeanors, and that I believe is right away. So raise the age. The other is you could sort of just start to bit by bit examine your system and pick where you want to make the most difference, where the biggest problem is, maybe the biggest opportunity, and drive change that way. The City of New York, with the Center for Court Innovation's help, has done a lot of research to look at young adults at every stage of the process from arrest to the last day of reentry to see what opportunities there are there. And we have a bunch of asset forfeiture money that both the District Attorney's Office and the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice has, where they're looking at changing policies and programs. One example, and I'll stop, right at the first moment of arrest, desk appearance tickets. So some counties, some boroughs, it's a really long time that you have to appear, and some it's closer. So we could look at young adults and older adults and see that for everybody, the longer it is that you have to appear, the more likely you are not to appear. But it's especially problematic for young adults who screw that up more frequently, right? My son can barely remember tomorrow, never mind 100 days from now, to go to court. And when you appear, there's a less than 1% chance that you'll get locked up. When you fail to appear, it's about 33%, so it's a 33-fold increase, not insubstantial. And because the Center for Court Innovation is super smart, they were able to create a risk assessment of all the young people at these different stages, and the people who fail to appear and the people who appear are about as risky as one another. It's not like this profound difference. So that 33-fold increase in incarceration isn't justified by the fact that these people would subsequently come out and reoffend. So, all right, what do we do with that? Well, there's a ton of stuff you can do with that, right? You can remind people, you can create an app, right? Hey, there's an app for that, right? Just remind people to go back to court. You can shorten the length of time between the desk appearance ticket and the actual appearance. You can train your court officials and say, look, the failure to appear doesn't matter that much. Base your decision on something else. Don't just be mad at the person for failing to appear. And you can imagine that level of knowledge at every stage. Every one of those approaches has advantages and disadvantages, right? The juvenile court's not exactly a pinnacle of strength and wisdom, so you dump a whole bunch of 18, 19, and 20-year-olds on it, you might hobble it a bit. It's super difficult to imagine, if you're a bureaucrat, creating a whole third system. And if you piecemeal it, you may never achieve the level of synergy that the juvenile court has right now, where you have people studying it, and you have people funding it, and you have case law around it. So all of those, you could argue differently. Connecticut has chosen to take a certain approach. Other jurisdictions will choose to take other approaches. I could talk more about that, but I see Adam fidgeting, so I will stop.
In a constructive way. So yes, of course, I could make it through the rest of the questions if we had another hour, but we have about 14 minutes or so. So there are a couple things I want to headline or get to. First of all, I want to ask Brent, so we know that there are these issues. We know there's some jurisdictions that are taking advantage of, that are being kind of entrepreneurial and creative and testing out some new innovations. And I want to mention one that I'm actually involved with in a minute. But I wanted to find out what kind of opportunities are there particularly through the Department of Justice for all of you guys here in this room to be testing things out.
Yeah, so there's the momentum on this, not just at the Department of Justice, but across the federal government and across the country is really remarkable. And so just to add on to some of what Vinnie said, every time I go somewhere to speak or Carol goes somewhere to speak about young adults, somebody from the crowd comes up and says, we're doing this in South Carolina.
Yep.
I had no idea. And there's extra confidentiality provisions for 18 to 25-year-olds in South Carolina or something along those lines when someone gets off of parole. That's remarkable. And then there's something else that's happening. And so what we've been finding are these pockets of innovation that have been taking place, that have really been occurring around the country, very often under the radar, not always connected to one another, but happening because people, the community, the systems, all realized that something different needed to happen, or there needed to be some special attention with the young adult population. And so, I think that's been incredibly instructive for us. One of the things that we're doing at OJP is the National Institute of Justice had an environmental scan that they launched. They hired an independent consultant to do an environmental scan and really try to find out what is happening in the field and gather all that information and bring it back. They're doing some of the analysis now. The time for submissions is closed, but we're looking at that in hopes that we'll be able to help inform some of the things that'll come next from OJP. Now that we really get a better understanding of the landscape, where do we go from there, both from a research standpoint and a programmatic standpoint. I think some of the things, and this will actually be a good lead into the program, Adam, that you want to talk about. In FY15, through the Bureau of Justice Assistance, we included priority consideration language in a couple of grants that went out, saying if you focus on 18 to 24-year-old young adults in a developmentally responsive manner, essentially priority consideration means you get, I don't want to misstate the peer review process, but you get looked at, your application gets an extra point or two. I don't know if that's the technical way that it happens, but you get priority consideration. It's pretty self-explanatory. And so that was an incredible move, right? Because we said this is one of those areas we think deserves extra attention. Now, CCI applied for a Smart Prosecution Grant in FY15. That was not one of the grants that had priority consideration for young adult language in it. And yet, they got the grant, they were awarded the grant to go work with young adults in Brooklyn. And so I'll let Adam talk about it a bit more, but I think it is instructive that this is an area that cuts across every aspect of the system. And so you don't necessarily have to wait for a young adult solicitation to present an application to work on that specific aspect of the system and still focus on young adults. And I think the work that CCI did and is now doing represents that.
And just before Adam goes, just quickly, like the first time I looked at this in New York, which was 2-3 years ago, it was the waning days of the Bloomberg administration, I pulled the data on arrests, violent arrests for young adults between the ages of 16 and 25. It was 49% of the violent arrests in New York City were young adults. Now, I don't think that means young adults commit half of the violent crime, because lots of times young people get arrested in groups for one single act in ways that older adults get arrested generally mano a mano, but it's a pretty non-trivial portion of the crime. So what Adam's going to talk about, I think, is it has the potential to have a pretty substantial impact.
Great. So I'm going to, let me just headline what we're doing now. In Brooklyn, it's really the Brooklyn DA's office who's the lead agency on this, and we're extremely excited that they're involved in this effort. We think that's really absolutely critical. But what we did was we teamed up with the Brooklyn DA's office and applied for a Smart Prosecution Grant and won it last year. And the idea is that we're creating, we've actually just launched a Brooklyn Young Adult Court. And in it, all 16 to 24s, and this is just to remind you that in New York, the age of criminal majority is 16, who have their cases that survive the first appearance, so past the arraignment, are sent to this one court part. And the way what we're trying to do essentially is both to improve public safety, but to achieve it by reducing unnecessary use of incarceration, reducing the use of criminal dispositions, which, as D.A. Thompson from Brooklyn points out, he doesn't want to over-criminalize, especially low-income communities of color that he and all of us are serving in Brooklyn, and increase the use of evidence-based practice and community-based interventions. So in this part, all misdemeanors come. We think that that's going to be somewhere between 5,000 and 9,000 cases a year. That we have started first by a specialized cross-agency training, which we just had last week, that was very exciting, that affirmed some of the different components of what we're doing to all of the players, including issues of brain development. We had not only the new judge who's been assigned there, but the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, we had court officer representation and the clerk for the part. And then, in some ways, what we're really hoping to do is system change and culture change, which have been two topics that, keep coming up over and over again. And one of the products of that training is that the different stakeholders all kind of said, it's great we're having this communication. We want more training in this building for everybody, but also let's keep up this communication. Let's keep meeting as a group. Let's bring the stakeholders together so we can make sure that this program works as well as it does. So what are the ingredients for that? We have a dedicated DA's DA bureau that's been created for that, and I just want to give a shout out to the team from the Brooklyn DA's office who's here, Joanne McAdoo, the bureau chief, who's been with the DA's office for a while, Shakiva Pierre, who's a project manager, and Anne Goodman-Lieb, who's ADA. So I think it's terrific that you guys are here for this. And then we also have, because it's a smart prosecution grant, we have some technical assistance and support, and Beth Marachnik from APA is here in that role. And so I think we're getting some of the raw materials for that. We have a dedicated DA's team. We have a dedicated judge. We have 2 defense providers. One of them is providing a dedicated team of defense attorneys, and we hope when all is said and done, we'll get a second team. But we think that's really important to make sure that people are communicating and working as well and collaborating as much as possible. We also are trying to bring evidence-based practice to this initiative so that we are using a risk and needs assessment tool, the one that we've developed that came up a couple times yesterday, CCAT as we call it, to identify not only the criminogenic risks, but the criminogenic needs that we can use as an opportunity to moderate those risks by coming up with interventions that are designed to reduce the risks. That CCAT tool, again, was developed with the support of DOJ, Bureau of Justice Assistance, and we've taken that and developed what we believe is an evidence-based intervention that's targeted to this population. We're calling it Up and Out. And again, that has been developed with the support of BJA, but it's something that is designed to directly address these criminogenic risks and needs in the population of 16 to 24s. And so we're just in the process of rolling that out too, and we think that's going to be very powerful. But the final thing that I want to mention, which of course has been coming up over and over again over the past couple days, is just that embedded through this are the ideas of procedural justice. And what we're hoping to do, you know, our hallmark, our community courts, you walk into them in a place like Red Hook, and I'm sure in many of your courts, and things feel different. It is a different culture. And what we've done we've tried to take those lessons and translate them into the high volume centralized courthouses that most of the criminal populations come through. And it's not the easiest thing in the world. You know, it's hard to walk into Brooklyn Criminal Court, where our Brooklyn Justice Initiatives Project is, or Bronx Criminal Court, where Bronx Community Solutions is, and have the same kind of feeling and culture. But I think we actually see this as a lab, this particular project, the Young Adult Initiative, as a lab to try and change the way the interactions are for all the players, including the court officers, including the judge, and we're excited, including the prosecution. So that's in short what we're trying to do. So I've managed to, pretty much kill our time, but I guess I want to see if you guys, first of all, I mean, I don't know, I want to see if you guys have anything you guys want to close with, whether there's a vision you have or, yeah.
So I'll jump in, somewhat of a vision, somewhat just notes that I want to make sure I say before we end in the next 3 minutes.
Yeah.
So one is, I think we're looking at this approach as being comprehensive. So we've talked almost exclusively about people who become justice involved, young people who are justice involved. I think our Office for Victims of Crime, in collaboration with OJJDP, has really done a wonderful job of also looking at this from the victim's perspective and saying we know boys and young men are most likely to be victims of crime, and they're the least likely to get those services they need when they are victims of violent crime. And so the FY15 Male Survivors of Violence went out onto the field. Those awards have since happened. But I think that's part of the broader perspective that we're taking at OJP, that really making sure that we're engaging and interacting with all people who come into contact with the system, regardless of how that contact occurs, and making sure that we have a developmentally responsive approach. And so that's one particular example. Something else I want to mention is that this work is happening cross-agency. It's not just an OJP conversation. it is happening. It's not just the Department of Justice conversation. The Department of Labor released last month $30 million for employment for justice-involved young adults, 18 to 24. It builds off of their past Face Forward work, but was influenced by the conversations we've been having in all of our cross-agency meetings around young adults, and that's huge. And I think it shows the change that's taking place, again, not just at DOJ, but across the federal family. HHS and HUD have also done things in this area. The Juvenile Reentry Assistance Program is set to be announced soon, we hope. And that's a really interesting program. It allows for sealing and expungement. Originally envisioned for kids in the juvenile justice system, it actually got expanded up to age 24 because of this recognition. And so this is happening in multiple areas. And the last thing that I'll say, and then I'll close out, is for us, for me, this is a very important conversation, this 18 to 24-year-old conversation. I think based on the way it's moved in the field, it's an important conversation for the field as well. It is part of a much broader conversation around criminal justice reform and the criminal justice system in general, and who should be proceeding into the deep end of the system and who should not. Where can we have diversion programs? Where can we do alternatives? And so, as much as this is a specific conversation around justice-involved young adults, I see it as one conversation, part of a broader dialogue that we're having in this country right now in a very positive way about looking at our criminal justice system in a really analytical way and determining what are we doing well and where do we need to move differently. And I think this is one aspect of that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Just a few. Just a few final thoughts. One is, before I forget to say it, we've established a clearinghouse website on this subject, and it's still in its early stages, but as Brent said, every time I go to a conference like this, I keep learning more, so I keep saying, all right, well, do me a favor, write this up and email it to me. I'll put it up on our website. So I work at the Harvard Kennedy School Program in Criminal Justice. I have zero idea what the URL is, so good luck with that, all right?
Yes.
There you go. There's it. And there's also this group who's devoted specifically to this in the UK called the Transition to Adulthood Alliance, and their website I actually know because I have to go to it, t2a.org.uk. There's fantastic stuff on it. The letter T, the number 2, the letter A, t2a.org.uk. Two thoughts closing. One is we didn't really mention the racial disparity issue here. Generally, we believe that African Americans are locked up at 6 times the rate of whites in America. For young adults, it's much worse. It's 9 times the rate of whites. So to the degree we can improve what we're doing in this area, it might have the impact of helping reduce some of the worst racial disparities in our system. And then finally, it's always, what's been very interesting to me is that the 2 states that are leading the charge on raising the age are the 2 states that most recently raised the age to 18, and in Connecticut and Illinois. And in the process of raising the age to 18, they heard many concerns by folks. There was a lengthy debate before they actually passed those bills. And that the courts would be overwhelmed, that the juvenile justice system would be overwhelmed, the kids would be thumbing their nose at law enforcement and running the streets if we raised the age to 18. And none of those things came true, and the opposite came true. In Connecticut particularly, they're at their lowest juvenile detention, at their lowest number of kids in commitment, so low that the governor has proposed to close Connecticut's last training school. The number of kids matriculating into adult prisons is the lowest it's been in 50 years. When you look at what happened to reoffending and offending by the age cohorts in both Connecticut and Illinois, where they were the ones where the age was raised, their reoffense rates and offense rates are lower than one would have expected based even on a decline. So not only did juvenile crime keep going down, but it went down more after Connecticut raised the age. Will that happen if they raise the age to 19 and into 20 into 21? We don't really know. Herb Sturz is the founder of the Vera Institute of Justice, and he once said, a wonderful way of increasing knowledge is to do something. I think this is a space in which things are bad enough right now, and we know enough to do something, whether the something you do is what Connecticut's doing, or what New York City's doing, or by the way, San Francisco's done some really terrific stuff on this, or what CCI is doing in Brooklyn. I think that really will depend on what's happening in your own jurisdiction, where the political winds are blowing, what is the most sort of viable, opportunistic moment, and what makes most sense from a public policy standpoint. But I would really encourage us to do something, because this is a group of young people that's suffering, and it's making us suffer too, because they're disproportionately going out and doing bad things when we fail to address what's troubling them.
So let's
Thank you,
take
Vinnie.
2 questions, and then anybody else who has questions, come on up after the break.
Good afternoon. Whoa. My name is Cliff Nellis. So there's a nonprofit organization in the city of Chicago called Juvenile Justice Initiative. Betsy Clark founded it. She's the one that's actually proposing a lot of the legislation. And she recently, last week, asked me to go down to Springfield and testify in favor of raising the juvenile court age of jurisdiction to 21. State's attorneys made 3 primary objections, and I'm just curious to know what you'd do to respond to this. One was, if we raise the juvenile court age of jurisdiction to 21 for misdemeanors in Illinois, we'll have 21-year-olds potentially in the same prison facility, the juvenile detention facility, as 13, 14, 15-year-olds. Second thing they said is pretty typical, like, well, we just don't have the resources, the juvenile system's going to be overburdened, or it's overburdened already, and now it's going to be even more overburdened if it goes up to 21. And then the third one was this rather, ridiculous existential argument about, well, how do we determine culpability? They can go off to war, or they can do this, but now we're not going to treat them as a minor, all this stuff. And it was very philosophical, to which I responded about the United States Supreme Court decisions, Graham Miller-Roper, and the brain science, and why we treat people differently up to 24. Those were the 3 primary things. I think there was a bunch of other things. It was very contentious. It went out of committee, 8-6 vote, but it is not likely to get passed. So I'm just curious. I know they're going to go back down. They're going to fight this. I'd love to hear what you guys would say to those 3 things, because those are the 3 big points.
I think that the argument about, the existential argument, I don't think it's a trivial one. I think that 18 it's a marker in our country, but it's not a marker for everything. And so it's a marker for when you can sign a contract, when you can get married without, when you can go to war, right? When you can vote. But it's not a marker for everything, right? You can't drink alcoholic beverages. Lots of cities are passing laws that you can't smoke until you're 21. You can't purchase a gun in a gun store, a handgun, until you're 21. You can't serve in Congress until you're 25. Maybe that's a bad example. You can stay on your parents' insurance till you're 26. It's really difficult to rent a car if you're under 25, which I think is super interesting, because I don't think Hertz doesn't want my son's money, right? But their actuaries tell them it's a bad bet. And insurance is super expensive for people under age 25, and for males, particularly under age 25. So some businesses are out there crunching these numbers, and they're coming to a different conclusion. And so many of the arguments that we can't raise the age to 21 or can't treat young people specially, I think we don't typically in criminal court, but we do in lots of other laws and lots of other practices. And those practices and laws make some level of sense. So one, and the other one I'll address. So there were 3. I'm not going to talk about the capacity issue. I think actually capacity is down in most juvenile justice systems, and to the degree you want to increase what happens to them now, you might actually have a better opportunity. And the number of kids in your training schools and your detention facilities actually dropped quite a bit. But what was the third one? Mixing. I think mixing is a real issue. I think that's a real issue, and I think we have to figure out the way to deal with it. It would only be misdemeanors, raising the age for misdemeanors. 4,000 misdemeanors were clicked into the Cook County Jail last year between the ages of 18 and 21. I'm damn concerned about those 18-year-olds in that adult jail with those adults. So yes, I'm also concerned about those 18-year-olds being in the Cook County Juvenile Detention Facility, they wouldn't go to the training schools because the training schools don't take misdemeanors anymore, so it really is only a detention issue. And I think that there needs to be some conversation about how to keep them separate, maybe separate facilities. And to the degree people are worried about doing this quickly, perhaps Illinois might want to consider taking the approach that Connecticut's taking, and instead of passing the bill to do it this year, pass a bill to have some entity write the bill for next year, so that all the judges and defense attorneys and prosecutors and probation people and detention people can get in a room and scream and yell and then come to consensus, which is exactly what they're doing in Connecticut, except they're nice in Connecticut, so they don't scream and yell.